2927 Broken Promises. The 7 suns that illuminated the great river were fashioned from the soul cores of the stone titan, an unholy titan the demon of dread had once slain. The suns were gone now, and Sunny was standing on the fragment of one of them. The crystalline island was dead and lightless, utterly devoid of the luminous radiance that had illuminated this world once. Sun Yu glanced around, mildly stunned. It was not every day that one walked on the surface of a sun, even if this one had been artificial. It's empty. He meant that there was no essence left in the shard of the sun, which itself had been a soul shard once. Either the light that had been contained within it dissipated when the sun was destroyed, or someone had absorbed it, like humans absorbed soul fragments by crushing shards in their fists. Was the thieving bird very hungry? Imagining that the odious bird had consumed the suns instead of simply stealing them made Sunny shiver. What if the damn thing was an unholy terror now, not a cursed one? If that was the case, there was no point in trying to fight it. Sunny had defeated numerous creatures of a higher rank than his in the past, but he was not arrogant enough to believe that he had a chance in a battle against an unholy abomination. He was not ready to face those horrors yet, not by a long shot. Nephis glanced around. The small flame dancing above her palm suddenly turned into a roaring plume of white fire, chasing away the darkness. In the dead silence that surrounded them, her even voice sounded almost unbearably loud. Let's explore. They meticulously searched the entire island, hoping to find something, anything, to help them understand what had happened in the tomb of Ariel. However, after an entire hour of fruitless exploration, they found nothing. No clues, no traces, no great mysteries hidden under the indestructible surface of divine crystal. All in all, the fragment of a broken sun was utterly dull. There was nothing exciting about it, only the vast expanse of jagged edges and uneven slopes. Do you think the river had gone shallow because the fragments of the sun fell into it? Nephis hesitated before responding. I am not sure. We do not know what sorcery Ariel had used to suspend the great river in the air and make it flow endlessly, so we can't know what broke it. She sighed and added in an uncertain tone. Maybe it happened because of this fragment. Or perhaps the river is simply dying because something stopped its current. In any case, we might encounter more of such shallows. It is good that both of us can fly. Sunny nodded. They rested on the fragment of a shattered sun for a while, then left it behind and continued on their way to Elydia's island. Nephis had been right. As they traveled across the great river, they encountered more of the shallows. None had shards of the broken sun floating in their center, though. There was just emptiness, a vast and quiet emptiness permeated by eternal darkness. Sunny carried them forward as the onyx serpent when the waters were deep. When the waters turned shallow and collapsed into pools of emptiness, they flew. Just like that, a few days passed. Sunny was in a much better shape by now, and the Shadow Legion was almost entirely restored. However, he felt worse than he had before. It was the silence was getting to him. Sunny and Nephis were not made for this kind of quiet. They had been born into a world at war, and spent most of their adult lives under the crushing pressure of conflict and strife. They were used to combat and battle, always fighting against impossible odds. So, peculiarly enough, the deathly tranquility of the tomb of Ariel was more tiresome than the harrowing peril of the war-torn hell. I almost want something to happen. Sunny knew better than to think such thoughts aloud, but could not help himself. He would gladly take a battle against some kind of horrible abomination over this dark, peaceful stillness. But no abomination appeared, and so, they made it to Elydia's island undeterred. The thick mist that had surrounded it once was gone. The colossal whirlpool was gone, as well, and instead of floating in the air above it, the island was simply resting on the water. The enormous sea serpent with scales as black as onyx slithered onto the shore of Elydia's island and turned into a man with porcelain skin and onyx eyes, his gaze dark and somber. A moment later, a malevolent obsidian dragon landed heavily on the sand, turning into a slender woman who seemed to be woven from darkness, shrouded in a mantle of ghostly smoke. A graceful knight wearing a suit of fearsome black armor walked out of the shadows, 2 ruby flames burning behind the visor of her helmet. Finally, a woman who was like a radiant goddess landed softly on the shore, her silver hair dancing in the wind. Sunny glanced around the familiar landscape, feeling deeply uncomfortable. His stay on Elydia's island had been up there with the worst experiences of his life, so being here again did not feel great. Nephis was her usual self, though, as if returning to this harrowing place did not bother her at all. This was where we killed Undying Slaughter. Nephis lingered for a moment, then added in a wistful tone. I only ever spent a single day here. But it felt like eternity. She was recovering, as well, and her emotions were slowly returning. Heading toward the towering cliffs, where treacherous steps were carved into the stone, she said in a neutral tone. In any case, the loop seems to have been broken. So, we do not need to worry about spending an eternity here. I think. Sunny smiled weakly. Well, as long as you're sure. There was no sin of Solace whispering into his ear anymore, so he would probably not even remember being in a loop again. Or perhaps his will would pierce the revolutions of time. Sunny did not know, and was determined not to find out. We'd better be careful. There were a lot of powerful nightmare creatures on this island in the past. He nodded to acknowledge Neff's warning, even if he knew about the abominations of Elydia's island far more than she did. He had been killed by most of them at least once, after all. Let's go. They ascended the stone steps and entered the forest. Neff's flame drowned a wide circle around them in bright light, but beyond it, darkness reigned. Naturally, Sunny's eyes could pierce through it, and his shadow sense had already enveloped the entire island. Because of that, he could already tell that there were no nightmare creatures here anymore. The soulless nightmare butterfly was gone. The harvester, a nebulous horror that had dwelled in the sky above the island, was gone, as well. So was the grotesque leopard that had stalked the forest, and all the rest of them. Only old bones remained. The forest itself was ravaged and largely destroyed, innumerable trees shattered or toppled by some awful force. The bone graveyard had been washed away by the waves. The carnivorous lake stood empty, and the tunnels dug deep under the surface had collapsed. As for Elydia's tower itself, as Sunny and Neffys crested the hill, he froze for a moment. The tower was there, right in front of them. What was left of it, at least. It had been almost entirely destroyed, turning into a forlorn ruin. All the upper floors were gone, and the lower ones were buried under the rubble. The very top of the tower seemed to have been thrown into the air and rolled to the base of the hill, then far into the forest, shattering in the process. From the look of how the stone debris fell, someone had dealt the tower a terrible blow, obliterating it completely. Sunny exhaled slowly. What the hell happened here? He did not mean Elydia's island. He meant the tomb of Ariel, the great river. Sunny did not know what the first loop of his third nightmare had looked like, but even if there were millions of challengers and the phantom of the Serpent King there, it had still been a nightmare meant for masters to conquer. Granted, the odds of overcoming that particular trial had been infernally low, unless, naturally, you were Neffys of the Immortal Flame clan. And even Neffys had died back then, in the first loop of the nightmare, and during countless loops after that. But this level of destruction, the things they had seen in Weave, in the empty waters where Fallen Grace had been, in the shallows on the way to Elydia's island, on the island itself, were far beyond what he had expected. It was not something that any master was meant to face, let alone conquer. Neffys shrugged. The most obvious answer is that a cursed terror escaped from a nightmare and descended upon the great river like a calamity that its rank and class entail. She lingered for a moment, then added. Naturally, just because an answer is obvious doesn't mean that it's correct. Turning away from the ruins of Elydia's tower, she sighed. In any case, we won't find anything of use here, just like we failed to find it in Weave and Fallen Grace. There's no point in searching anymore. Our next stop will be Verge, and from there, the estuary. Neffys smiled faintly. Who knows? The first seeker might still be alive. If so, I might be able to kill it again. They went about making camp. Soon, Neffys closed her eyes to sleep while Sunny kept watch in front of a fire. The small island of warmth and light was surrounded by boundless darkness. Sunny glanced into the darkness and listened to the silence that reigned over the still expanse of the great river, shadows dancing on his somber face. At the same time, another incarnation of him was making its way to the ruins of Elydia's tower. Climbing carefully over the rubble, he reached the side of the hill that was relatively free of debris. That was because the blow that destroyed the tower had come from that direction, sending the debris flying the other way. There, in the darkness, he found what he had sensed hours before, but kept to himself. It was not that he wanted to hide something from Neffys, it was just that he couldn't explain it to her without speaking about his past, which she could never remember. What Sunny had found was a humble grave. There was no inscription on the tombstone, and no way of knowing if someone was actually buried under the raised soil. However, a scattering of lovely flowers was growing on the grave and around it, creating a gorgeous meadow in the middle of the ruin. Sunny could not see their color in the darkness, but knew that the petals were of a vibrant azure hue. Just like the flower Windflower had given him once in a dream, the last dream she ever saw. Sitting down in front of the grave, Sunny pulled a bottle of wine from the folds of his nebulous mantle, uncorked it, and poured some onto the ground. Is that you, whined Flower? He remained silent for a long while, then glanced down. If so, I'm sorry. I broke the promise I gave you. Like all the other promises I gave, and then broke. You wanted to die by the hand of a person who would conquer the nightmare, but in the end, I abandoned my cohort to pursue selfish goals. I wasn't even there when they destroyed the first Seeker. He glanced away, smiling bitterly, and took a sip of the wine. I really hope to meet you again, you know. Sunny took a deep breath, staring into the darkness with a distant expression. Your phantom asked me to relay a message should I ever meet the real you. She wanted me to tell you that she had done her best. That they all had, but I guess that's not an option now, is it? Sunny pursed his lips. Because you are gone, and their best was not enough. He remained silent for a long time, and then drank the wine once more. But I just wanted you to know that I used your gift well. It helped me a lot to get to where I am. Thank you for that. You were the first person to ever give me flowers, so, please, accept this gift from me, as well. Raising a hand, he called upon the shadows and manifested a black flower out of them, the most gorgeous flower he could think of and create. Planting it gently on the nameless grave, Sunny sighed heavily and stood up. Nobody remembers me anymore, and because I was the only one who met you, no one remembers you either. Seems unfair, doesn't it? But don't worry, even though I broke my promise, I have come back now to set things right. Just wait a little longer. Soon, everyone will tell the tales about you. About Windflower of the Twilight Sea. He watched the grave silently for a while longer, then took a step back and dissolved into the shadows, leaving only the black flower behind. Far away, on the shore of Aletheia's island, Sunny was staring into the dancing flames. A shadow crept across the sand and wrapped itself around him, careful not to disturb Neff's sleep. Sunny remained silent for a long time, then sighed lightly. To Verge, then, and to the estuary from there. The goal of their harrowing journey was drawing near. 2928 Confession. Whenever Sunny slept, some part of him always remained awake. There were 7 of him, after all, so, it was rare for all of his incarnations to be asleep at the same time. After finding the nameless grave on the hill where Aletheia's tower had once stood, however, he chose to surrender himself to sleep completely. Even though nothing had happened since they entered the tomb of Ariel, he needed a break. The nothingness of it all was exhausting. Eventually, though, Sunny woke up. He remained still for a while, looking at Neff's PGO file. She was sitting by the fire, looking at the dancing flames, just like he had been doing during his watch. Her usually stoic expression seemed reserved and pensive in the warm light of the fire. It is strange, you know. Even though she did not turn to look, she must have noticed that he was awake. Sunny did not move, either. What is? Neffes lingered for a short while, then shrugged. Sitting by the fire in the tomb of Ariel, utterly ruined, acting like nothing is the matter. Finally turning, she smiled faintly. Her smile was a little bit bitter, and a little bit dark. I had spent so much time building my kingdom, all my life, really, and now, in the span of a few short months, all of it is gone. My citadels, my armies, my comrades, my people, all I have left now are the things I can carry with me. I must be the first homeless sovereign in history. Sunny remained silent for a moment, then smiled as well. Well, to be fair, you can carry quite a lot with you. An entire flying ship, for example, and that is just the tip of the iceberg. Neffes chuckled. That's true. She turned back to the flame, and to the darkness beyond it. You went somewhere while I slept, didn't you? Sunny lingered for a few seconds, then sighed. I did. How did you know? I tried not to wake you. She shook her head lightly. It was because you were different when I woke up. So, I figured that something must have happened. Neffes reached forward and cupped her hands, thrusting them into the fire. She scooped some of it, as one would scoop water, and then washed her face in the brilliant white flame. A moment later, she let out a satisfied sigh and turned to Sunny again, looking refreshed. Do you still have coffee? Sunny sat up, summoned an enchanted thermos he had once created, and poured the fragrant drink into 2 cups. As they enjoyed their morning coffee in utter darkness, he considered his words for a long while. Eventually, though, he still said, "You never ask me any questions." It was true. When the two of them were together, Sunny rarely had to say something because of his flaw. As a result, there were few situations when he said something to Neffes, only for her to forget it seconds later. It was very convenient of Sunny and made his life much easier, but at the same time, he often felt conflicted about the whole situation. At times, he felt insecure, thinking that Nefis simply did not care enough to ask. Other times, he felt that it was not fair to her, since no matter what she did, she would never receive an answer, would never be able to truly know the man with whom she shared her life. But Sunny never brought it up, because doing so would not solve anything. And she would not be able to remember having talked about it, either. Nefis shrugged. That is strange, as well. Looking into the fire, she sighed. You and Cassie are closer to me than anyone else. And both of you keep a million secrets. So, it is a bit ironic that I know very little about the people I trust the most. She lingered for a few moments and then added. But that was our deal, wasn't it? You said that you had secrets you would never reveal to me. And I promised that I would never value you more than my goal. Nefis chuckled. Looking back, we were acting quite mature when having that conversation. But also quite stupid. She shook her head. At the beginning, I thought that it would be simple, to allow someone into my life without inviting them into my heart. I never had any experience with the affairs of the heart, after all, so it was easy to be arrogant. But as time went on and we grew closer, nothing was simple. Everything was complicated. She looked at Sunny and smiled. I never ask you any questions, but I used to ask myself all the time. Where does he come from? Who were his parents? What was his childhood like? Who was his first love? Why does he love me? Things like that. There were so many questions, and not a single answer. As if you were keeping yourself under lock and key, as if you didn't care about me enough to share yourself with me. Nefis shook her head. I am not a fool, though. Even if we never spoke about it, it did not take me long to figure out that you were keeping quiet because you were unable to speak, not because you did not want to. I also noticed that, at times, my memory failed me. It happens when I think about you, or in the middle of a conversation. One moment, we are talking about something, but the next moment, we are talking about something else, and I don't quite remember how we got there. As if I got distracted. She looked at the dancing flames, then at the darkness beyond them. And I also know that all of it has something to do with this. With the tomb of Ariel. This is where it all started. Nefis turned to Sunny and shrugged. But it doesn't matter, really. I used to drive myself mad with these questions, but at some point, I realized that it did not matter. I do not need to know who your parents were, what your childhood was like, or where you come from. Because I know you. I might not know about you, but I know who you are. You are my person. I trust you. She looked away and sighed. I used to want to have everything under my control. I even deluded myself into thinking that it was, at times. Because the world was too frightening otherwise. But a part of growing up is realizing that you cannot control everything. Once you let go, life gets easier. And you can hold on to the important things, instead of helplessly grasping at all of them. Nefis lingered for a moment and then looked at Sunny with a smile. Now that I think about it, I feel like I've been cheated in that deal of ours. He chuckled. Are you saying that I made my way into your heart, uninvited? Is that a confession, Lady Changing Star? They were on Aledia's island, of all places. What was it about this terrifying pit of nightmares that made people prone to admitting their feelings? It was certainly not a romantic spot. It was the opposite of a romantic spot, really. Nefis shrugged. I am just saying that I know you well enough not to ask questions, Lord Shadow. I know who you are, and who you are is enough. It's plenty. Sunny lingered for a while, then looked away to hide his smile. It's nice to hear. Nefis finished her coffee and stood up. Maybe it's why I do not feel crushed despite having lost the human domain to the Dreamspawn. I feel that I will get it all back, because I am not alone. Looking into the darkness, she remained silent for a few moments, and then said quietly. No one survives in the dream realm alone. So, I was lucky to find you. Sunny studied her profile for a while. Eventually, he nodded. Quote. You certainly were. Men of my caliber don't grow on trees, you know. There's only a handful in the whole wide world, 7, to be precise. And all of them are me. Nefis sighed. Don't I know it well. 2929 on the Verge. They left Aledia's island soon after. The journey to Verge was long, but uneventful. The waters of the great river grew more and more shallow the closer to the defiled city they got, and they had to fly for long stretches of time. Wanting to save Nefis from having to use her aspect all the time, Sunny politely suggested that Slayer should carry them on her broad draconic back. That was the closest he came to losing his head for the second time, this time to a dragon's fangs instead of a sharp blade. Luckily, most of his shades had already been mended. So, in the end, the two of them rode on the backs of two obsidian wasps, flying above the great river at an astonishing speed. Neffys lighted their way, and from afar, they must have looked like a shooting star that rushed across the endless expanse of the great river, its brilliant radiance reflecting in the still, dark water. As they neared Verge, however, Sunny dismissed the wasps and manifested shadows into a thin layer of solid matter atop the river, creating a perfectly flat island that stretched several kilometers in all directions. Prepared for battle, they continued forward on foot. As they did, Neffys remembered the final battle of the third nightmare, the battle Sunny had missed. Verge was a city of the Seekers of Truth once, one they built as close to the estuary as they could. But when we found it, only the very edges of the city remained. The rest was buried under the first Seeker. Sunny had heard the story before, but never in much detail. What was it like, the first Seeker? Neff's expression turned grim. It was a vast, formless mass of red flesh that covered the world like a spreading tumor. The entire city was overgrown by it, and the flesh was spilling into the great river, infecting it. The first Seeker was continuing to grow, as well. When we beheld it for the first time, it was easy to imagine that this abominable flesh would cover all of the great river one day, consuming the entire tomb of Ariel. She lingered for a while, and then added. Much worse was the fact that the first Seeker was not merely an abomination. It was the source of the defilement, the origin of the horrid curse that had befallen the great river. Touching its flesh meant becoming instantly infected by the corruption, so how were we supposed to destroy it? Neffys shook her head, and there were the defiled themselves. Even if all the plagues were gone by then, the ruins of Verge still teemed with abominations. They were powerful and ancient, as well, many of them were corrupted, some were fallen. The first Seeker itself, and countless nightmare creatures guarding it, it all seemed like an impossible task for a handful of masters to complete. Sunny raised an eyebrow. And you just blew it all up. Neffys smiled. No, not really, not immediately, at least. That thing was too vast to be destroyed even by my flames. She looked ahead and sighed. We concluded that the first Seeker had to have a heart, or a core, at least. Somewhere in the depths of that sea of flesh, the remains of Aletheia of the Nine were buried deep. So, we wanted to reach them and destroy the source of the first Seeker. Neff's expression became grim. I was the only one who could walk across the flesh of the first Seeker uncorrupted, so that was a task I had to accomplish alone. Before that, however, we had to get as close to it as we could, past the great legion of the defiled. Mordred was instrumental there. In fact, without him, we would have never made it to the first Seeker alive. She paused for a moment, then continued in a disdainful tone. He led us past the defiled through the reflections. So, we made it inside Verge, as close to the flesh of the first Seeker as we could. The defiled still sensed us, of course. Kai and Effie stayed back to hold them off. Mordred and Cassie lured some away, acting as bait, while I climbed the mountain of flesh and attempted to reach the heart of the city. She grimaced. When I did, I tried to carve a path into the heart of the first Seeker. I tried to burn it, as well, but the flesh was growing faster than I could destroy it. Somewhere behind me, my cohort was buying me time, drowning in a devastating flood of the defiled. They were being pushed back, toward the first Seeker, toward becoming defiled themselves. Neffys shook her head and smiled weakly. Well, you know the rest. I detonated 6 of my 7 cores in the end, unleashing 6 times the devastation I had visited upon Twilight. That did it, ever so succinct. They had reached the end of the island of shadows Sunny had created by then. She looked ahead, remained silent for a moment, and said in a disgruntled tone. Now that I am supreme, I think just a couple of cores will do. Maybe even 1. Walking to the edge, Sunny took a step over it. The black layer laying atop the water extended, supporting his foot. At the same time, somewhere far away, the island of shadows began to collapse. I am here this time. And while I am not immune to the corruption, I know how to destroy things from afar. So, hopefully, you won't need to sacrifice even a single soul core. The walk across the water, a dark path appearing under their feet. Soon enough, Verge came into sight. Sunny and Neffys stopped, looking ahead in somber silence. We've had been destroyed, and Fallen Grace was missing. Even Aletheia's island had not escaped the devastation. Verge was still here, though, even if it was changed. The one thing distinguishing it from the phantom copy that had existed in the depths of the nightmare was that the first Seeker was gone. The abominable sea of flesh that had once drowned the city of the seekers of truth was no more, gone without a trace. 2930 City of Bones. Out on the edges of Verge, the dilapidated buildings still stood, ancient darkness nestling in their empty doors and windows. Further away, though, the city was flattened, having turned into a stone valley. That was where the mountains of flesh that belonged to the first seeker once lay, but they were there no more. Nothing was moving in Verge. Nothing was alive. Instead, the entire city was littered with bones. Countless bones lay scattered among the ruins. Some seemed like they had belonged to humans once, some were gruesomely deformed and twisted. Some were small, while some were giant. Some lay alone, stuck between the rubble, some lay in towering piles. There were hollowed-out carapaces of enormous, monstrous creatures as well. There were skeletal remains of abominable leviathans. One thing that lacked in the City of Bones, however, was the defilement. Its source had disappeared, and the defilement itself vanished as well. What do you see? Nefis could not see in the darkness, and the light of her flame did not reach that far. She could sense it, though, the absence of the terrifying enemy she had been prepared to destroy for the second time. Sunny sighed. It's gone. The first seeker, the defiled, they are all gone. At that moment, he felt like he understood what kind of calamity had befallen the great river. What kind of unstoppable, merciless monster had visited such final devastation upon it, leaving only silence and desolation in its wake. It was time. Shadow God might have created death, but time was the ultimate killer. It destroyed everything. In the end, even the great river had eventually fallen to its ruthless cruelty, despite being the river of time. Sunny remained silent for a while longer, then shook his head. Let's go. Together, they entered Verge and traversed its empty streets, stepping over the ancient bones. Then, they climbed the flattened ruins and walked across them, as well. Having crossed the Sea of Bones, they reached the other edge of the fallen city and saw the dark, still water Aga Inn. Nefis stared at it for a long while, then closed her eyes for a moment. Everything is different from how I imagined. She exhaled slowly. I really thought that at least the first seeker would be here. Sunny nodded. Me too. Then, he looked into the darkness, where the estuary, and the vile thieving bird, awaited. There is nothing for us here. Let's go. It shouldn't be far, now. They left the City of Bones behind. Once, a long time ago, Sunny had sailed the last stretch of the great river on a small ketch. He had encountered many terrifying nightmare creatures back then. The most terrifying abominations of the great river dwelled in the furthest reaches of the past and in the most distant future, after all. But even those horrors were nowhere to be found. So, Sunny and Nefis traveled in relative peace. It was just that the waters of the great river were growing thinner and thinner the closer to the estuary they came. In the end, the great river simply ceased. There was not even a great waterfall where its water ended, just a gradual termination. The shallows grew vast, and then, they became ubiquitous. Instead of islands of empty darkness interrupting the surface of the still water like pustules, it was the small islands of water that broke the vast expanse of empty darkness, separated by a great distance. And finally, Sunny and Nefis reached a patch of shallow water that seemed to be the last. There was none that could be seen from it, at least. All that remained was an endless and dark vastness. A great abyss of dark nothingness. And somewhere far away, too, distant to be seen, a hint of something hidden in the darkness. Manifesting a thin layer of shadows atop the water, Sunny walked to the very edge and looked down, a pensive expression on his face. He lingered for a few moments, and then asked somberly, "Now what?" Instead of answering, Nefis raised a hand and pointed into the distance. Sunny, look. She could not see through the darkness, so it was doubtful that she noticed something that he had not. However, that was exactly what happened. Because when Sunny looked where she was pointing, he immediately realized what she meant. There was light in the darkness. Far away, a scattering of tiny sparks was moving slowly, growing a little brighter. As if coming their way. The two of them remained motionless, watching the distant lights approach. Soon enough, they saw it. There was a ship sailing across the emptiness. It had a strange and archaic silhouette, different from how the ships were built both in the waking world and in the dream realm, but quite similar to how they had been built by the river people. The hull was entirely covered in intricate engravings, and the black sails were beautifully embroidered with silver thread. The sparks were the lanterns that shone on the ship's masts. To Sunny, it looked like the ferry meant to carry the souls of the dead to the underworld. Stay alert. Soon enough, the ship approached the island of water they were standing upon and came to a halt, resting on it. Sunny and Neffys glanced at each other, then jumped up to land on its deck. There, both of them froze. It can't be. How? Sunny's breath caught in his chest. Because someone was waiting for them aboard the mysterious ship. It was an exquisitely beautiful young woman wearing a black mantle. With her small stature and glistening ebony hair, dusky skin and piercing blue eyes, she looked like an enchanting river spirit. Her lovely face was lively and captivating, and her eyes glistened, reflecting Neff's flame. The young woman studied them for a few moments, and then bowed deeply. Her voice was bright and melodious. "Hail Weaver, demon of fate. Firstborn of the unknown." The young woman straightened, looked at them, and then smiled warmly. Her disarming smile was bright enough to illuminate the world. "Ananke greets the children of Weaver." Sunny simply stood there, frozen. Neffys, meanwhile, took a step forward as if mesmerized. "Ananke, you are alive." The young woman looked at them with a hint of confusion. "Why, it would seem so. Don't I look alive, my lady?" "It is." Before she could finish the sentence, Neffys reached forward and pulled her into a tight embrace. Sunny was finally able to move, as well. He hesitated for a moment, then said in a raspy voice. "The children of Weaver greet Ananke of Weave." 2931 Swaying chains. Drowning in the shadow of the ebony tower, pouring her essence into the runic array meant to protect it from the great army of humanity, Cassie, the witch who had betrayed her kind to help the wicked butcher, Mordred of Nowhere, inhaled deeply and then called upon Hiji Aspect. She was resorting to something that she had forbidden herself from doing in the wake of Astarion's resounding victory over the Longing Domain. She was reaching into the hearts of those witnessed by her dormant ability and leaving her mark on them. Blind and maimed, she was opening myriad eyes to look upon the final battle of the bitter war from countless perspectives. It used to be that Cassie could only mark those with whom she had shared physical contact. But she had been learning how to use her aspect better, as well. She had been reaching new levels of mastery over her powers, slowly perfecting her craft. And now, she could finally see. Of course, she was also making herself vulnerable to Astarion and his wicked authority. But now that everyone had already become enthralled by the monstrous Supreme, it did not matter that much, especially because the battle was going to be long over by the time her mind could become irrevocably infected by his insidious power. And so, Cassie saw. She witnessed. A great swarm of echoes and winged abominations rose from the islands surrounding the ebony tower, rushing across the chasm like a vast cloud of darkness. Their advance seemed unstoppable, and yet, Mordred did not look bothered. He watched them fly across the lilac sky silently, his mirror-like eyes reflecting the approaching calamity with a hint of disinterest. If a swarm like that had been summoned to defend Antarctica, the chain of nightmares would have been drowned in the blood of nightmare creatures. If it had been summoned in America, humanity would not have lost the western hemisphere of its own home planet. Just a small fraction of the swarm would have washed over the forgotten shore, saving all the sleepers of the Dark City. But today, it was merely an opening act of a far more terrifying battle. It was a diversion meant to shield the true attack. By the time the aerial combatants of the Hunger Domain reached halfway to the Ebony Island, Mordred finally responded. His vessels moved, rending the sky apart with a world-ending barrage of ranged attacks. Those of them who had been human once took aim, calling upon their aspects and activating a sea of enchantments woven into their memories. Most of them had been nightmare creatures, though, so the attacks they unleashed were eerie and hideous. On one side of the Ebony Island, a long black arm extended from the towering hill of dark hair. An eerily human-like hand grasped a giant slab of obsidian and squeezed it, sending cracks running through the surface of the indestructible stone. Then, the creature rose to its feet, revealing its gargantuan, monstrous visage. The ape-like abomination hurled the enormous boulder into the approaching storm, raising a hurricane and causing a deafening sonic boom to roar as it shook the sky. On the other side of the island, an abominable vessel that looked like a giant tick rose its swollen belly to the sky, myriad shapes moving under the gray skin in a ghastly pattern. Then, tens of thousands of bleeding holes opened on its surface, and something shot from it at tremendous speed, filling the air with a chilling buzzing. Those were millions of hideous wasps leaving their nest and flashing across the sky like sentient bullets. Their wings were razor-sharp, and their mandibles were covered in deadly venom. They shredded everything that appeared in their path, and soon, the sky was washed by blood, a storm of ethereal sparks swirling in the hurricane winds. As blood and light filled the sky above like a terrifying storm, the blood that was being spilled in the sky below remained unseen. There, a different kind of wasp had clashed with the hidden forces approaching the Ebony Island under the cover of darkness. These were enormous and utterly lethal, their translucent bodies almost invisible in the lightless void that rested under the chained isles. There were countless other vessels of the King of Nowhere eradicating the great swarm, as well. Many of them were winged themselves, rising into the sky to meet the enemy. And above it all, below it all, beneath it all, his will was clashing against the will of the Dreamspawn, sending ripples through the fabric of existence. Cassie drew a shaky breath, controlling the defensive array to do what little she could in this cataclysmic battle of two inhuman giants. As the great swarm of echoes and enthralled abominations rushed toward the Ebony Island, distracting its defenders, the true assault began. Far away, across the vast chasm of the Tear, the armies of humanity moved forward. As they did, stepping on the desolate soil of the nearest islands, clouds of scarlet spores escaped from beneath it, spreading swiftly in the wind. Harrowing screams filled the air, and Cassie could not help but shudder when she felt one of her marks dying in unbearable agony. Soldiers fell to the ground, convulsing, blood spilling from their mouths, their noses, their eyes. But the army of the Hunger Domain was simply too vast and too powerful to be deterred, while the hearts and minds of its soldiers were too consumed by Astarion for fear or reluctance to take hold. Controlled by him, the soldiers simply stepped over the dead, ignoring the pleas of their companions and comrades to continue the unstoppable advance. Astarion's army split into 7 legions, each flowing onto one of the celestial chains to cross the dark void of the sky below and conquer the Ebony Island. Mordred finally showed a reaction. Looking at the 7 colossal chains, he inhaled deeply and then glanced at Cassie with interest. "What do you think will happen if I sever the chains?" She remained silent for a few moments, then said in an even tone. "I suppose they will all fall down. They would fall endlessly into the darkness, until their lifeless corpses were finally swallowed by the divine flames, except for those who would plummet through the rift. Those unfortunate souls would probably continue falling for all eternity, since no one had ever been able to discover the bottom of the sky below." Cassie pursed her lips slightly. "The Dreamspawn will send winged thralls to rescue saints and masters, those who do not possess memories that can help them fly out of the darkness, at least. But the awakened soldiers will die." She turned her head slightly, facing Mordred. "Still, it will decrease the pressure on you. And it is not like the Ebony Island will fall. After all, it is holding up the chained isles in the skies, not the other way around. So why haven't you severed the chains yet?" Mordred studied her for a moment, then smiled and glanced away. "So heartless." With that, he sent his reflections forth. They dashed toward the great celestial chains, and the monstrous vessels of the King of Nothing followed, assembling into 7 ghastly columns. In the deafening roar of the heavenly battle, under a blood rain, they poured onto the chains like loathsome rivers, hurrying forward to meet the armies of humanity. The great chains swayed and groaned loudly, their rattling sounding like the death wails of the world. A dreadful battle above, a terrifying battle below. The forces of the King of Nothing clashed with the legions of the Dreamspawn between 2 skies, causing a ghastly clamor to drown out the groans of the great heavenly chains. 2932 Under Heaven. Cassie swayed faintly, overwhelmed by the dreadful scale of the battle. It looked as if the world was ending. The world was really ending, no matter which side won, so that a new, ghastly world could be born from its corpse. What is my endgame here? Suddenly, Cassie felt lost. She had resolved herself to stand by Mordred till the bitter end, but she did not want him to win. His victory today would mean that humanity had been wiped out, all its awakened warriors, at least, which meant the same in the world of the nightmare spell. So, Cassie did not know what she was doing here. No, she did. She had made a choice to fight with Mordred for a reason, so, these frightened thoughts did not belong to her. They were the Dreamspawn's poison seeping into her mind now that she had opened it. Once more, gritting her teeth, Cassie focused on the battle. Far away, the vessels of Mordred and the forces of humanity collided on the surface of the 7 great chains. The 2 sovereigns had chosen different tactics in this harrowing clash. Mordred sent his most fearsome champions, his reflections, to lead the armies of detestable vessels. Astarion, meanwhile, kept his strongest champions back, first sending weaker thralls forward to exhaust the reflections. It was a chilling massacre. The massacre was really chilling because one of the reflections was wearing Cassie's own face, slaughtering humans with utter lack of mercy or hesitation. So, it was like watching herself murdering them. For a brief moment, Cassie wondered if Mordred was doing that to torment her. But no, he was simply commanding one of the reflections to mirror Cassie because her powers were simply too lethal in combination with his own. Not only did they allow the reflection to sense its adversary's movements in advance, but they also made it so that reflection could warn the other 6, as well. As a result, all 7 were far more unassailable and lethal than they would have been otherwise. If the Dreamspawn had any qualms about burying them under a tide of human bodies, he did not show it. Instead, he allowed ascended and awakened warriors to die by their hands, claws, and maws in scores. He really did not want to sacrifice the lives of the saints, it seemed. Because the saints were meant to become his main course when he eventually devoured humanity. Astarion was forced to change his strategy soon, though. It was because the human waves he sent to bury the reflections not only failed to weaken them, but were actually making them stronger. It was as if they were offered an impossibly generous feast of human souls, and as torrents of soul fragments poured into their depths, the reflections absorbed them like a dry riverbed. As Cassie watched, one of them actually evolved in class, gaining newfound strength. That was why Astarion reacted, having judged that the necessity of sending forward his strongest champions far outweighed the risk now. The cadence of the fierce battle on the heavenly chains changed. The human soldiers retreated in eerie unity, and instead, their commanders moved forward to lead the charge. On one of the chains, Seishan appeared like a walking nightmare, her grotesque figure obscured by a bloody haze. On another chain, a swarm of crows descended to form a figure of a tall, gaunt man. Somewhere else, a river of liquid metal flowed across the links of the great chain, rushing forward like an unstoppable silver flood. When the advancing saints crashed into the reflections, the Ebony Island quaked. Mordred clicked his tongue. Does he really think that these pathetic? However, before he could finish the sentence, his expression changed. 6 of the 7 reflections managed to repel the fierce assault of the human saints, entangling them in a ferocious melee. However, on the chain where Morgan had appeared, the reflections was almost instantly overwhelmed and pushed back, the surface of its mirrored body covered by cracks and on the verge of shattering. Mordred gritted his teeth. It seems that I am spread too thin. His tone sounded relaxed and amused, but his expression was dark. A moment later, the wounded reflection retreated into the darkness of the sky below, escaping the lethal river of steel. The flood of metal, meanwhile, coalesced into the figure of a woman with black hair and cold, cutting vermilion eyes. Facing a sea of Mordred's vessels that stretched into the distance, covering the length of the heavenly chain, she smiled chillingly and lunged forward. Blood spilled on cold alloy. Morgan's Breaketh Roa forced Mordred to change his tactic, as well. The reflections retreated one by one, allowing the saints to advance toward the vessels of the King of Nothing himself. 7 bloody battles unfolded on the groaning chains that swayed above an endless void, 2 vast swarms of abominations ripping each other apart above them. Mordred was also fighting a battle on the Ivory Island, on the Night Garden, and on the islands that surrounded the tear, preventing the assault forces from being endlessly reinforced. The whole world seemed to have dissolved into chaos and slaughter. He managed to hold most of the chains, but on a few, his forces were being pushed back. Morgan especially seemed almost unstoppable, reaching closer and closer to the Ebony Island. Cassie did not know what kind of purpose she seemed to have found, or what kind of reason had been instilled in her by the Dreamspawn, but the former Princess of War was proving to be a force to be reckoned with, a force far more frightening and lethal than any other saint on the battlefield. And all Astarion needed was for one chain to be conquered, not all 7 of them. Watching his sister slaughter his vessels, Mordred sighed. Dear sister, I really should have killed her all those years ago, when I first returned to Bastion. Shaking his head regretfully, he glanced to where the silhouette of the Ivory Island loomed high in the sky, obscured by the battling abominations. Somewhere on its shores, Astarion was probably looking down and smiling at them. Mordred raised a hand and rubbed his temple, grimacing briefly. Get out of my head, damn it. Uttering a quiet curse, he inhaled deeply and smiled. Let's take it up a notch, shall we? Somewhere far away, at the base of the heavenly chains connected to the flying islands, the 7 reflections appeared from the darkness of the sky below, landing among the soldiers of the Hunger Domain and cutting off the assault forces from the main mass of the army. At the same time, innumerable vessels poured from the reflections on every island where the human soldiers were assembled, widening the frightening scope of the battle even further. Mordred was throwing all of himself into the fight now, not leaving himself a way out. Not holding anything back, holding nothing back. Somewhere above, Astarion prepared to descend onto the battlefield personally. Cassie glanced down and closed her one remaining eye, overwhelmed by the bloodshed. One of the chains snapped. The children of Weaver greet an Ankh of Weave. Sunny stared at the gorgeous young woman whom Nephis was hugging tightly. Ananke wore a surprised expression, his own must have been just as stunned. It was really her. Ananke, the last priestess of the nightmare spell, was still alive. She was alive and not beholden to the currents of the great river anymore, it seemed, like all river people were meant to be. Well, it made sense. The currents of the great river were no more, after all. 2933 King of the River People. Before Sunny could come to terms with meeting Ananke, the real Ananke, who had never met the Mad Prince, and therefore never got to travel with Sunny and Neffys, he found himself in the lounge cabin of the mysterious ship, being treated to tea, wine, and delicious food. Ananke even used the same enchanted lacquered box and dinnerware as she had in the nightmare. The similarity to how they had met for the first time was simply too peculiar. It made Sunny want to ponder the mechanics of how the spell brought its phantoms to life, and whether its knowledge of all things having to do with the past was founded on its ability to fathom the strings of fate. However, at the moment, he was not really in the mood for philosophical ponderings. Barely remembering to touch his food, he simply stared at Ananke, feeling both stunned and full of joy. Ecstatic, almost. It was just like Neffys said, they had not spent a lot of time with the Ananke in the nightmare, but the old priestess occupied a special place in Sunny's heart. Her loss had hit him especially hard, just like it had Neffys. So, seeing her once again filled him with happiness. Enough of it to suppress his curiosity for a short while, even, and dissuade him from asking any questions. Ananke watched them with a hint of reverence and amazement, and curiosity, as well. Sunny and Neffys couldn't look away from her either. Eventually, she chuckled. Ananke of Weave, no one has called me that in a long, long time. Weave was destroyed centuries ago, after all, thousands of years. I am surprised that you know that ancient name, my lord and lady. Her voice was still warm and bright, but betrayed a hint of wistful melancholy for a brief moment, as if she was remembering a deep wound that had long scarred over. Sunny and Neffys glanced at each other. In the end, it was Sunny who spoke. I'm Sunless, and this is Neffys. There is no need to use honorifics when talking to us, we are of the same rank, after all. Indeed, it was true. He could see it as clear as day when he gazed into the soul of Ananke. There, a radiant soul core was shining like a summer sun. She was supreme now, just like the two of them. Ananke lingered for a few moments, then smiled. Oh, I couldn't. You are the chosen of Weaver, after all. Lord Sunless, Lady Neffys. He sighed. How does that even work? You were already a carrier of the nightmare spell when it was in its infancy, its caretaker, even, or at least a descendant of its caretakers. Now that it has fully matured, you should be no different from Neffys. As much a child of Weaver as she is, really. Ananke glanced at him with a hint of confusion in her azure eyes, then shrugged lightly. I wouldn't know, Lord Sunless. We knew nothing about what happened outside the tomb of Ariel after entering it. We could only hope that the promise Weaver had given us would be fulfilled, and the children of Weaver would save everyone from the doom. Weaver's promise was the nightmare spell, and the doom she mentioned was the spreading corruption, the nightmare of the forgotten god. Ananke hesitated for a few moments, then asked tentatively. So, how is it going, my lord and lady? Saving everyone from the doom, and the like. She had to be very curious about them. In fact, Neffys and Sunny must have seemed like mythical creatures to her. They were people from outside the tomb of Ariel, after all, which was a mythical place for the river people. Sunny coughed. Well, he considered his words for a bit, then shrugged. It's the age of the nightmare spell out there. All the realms are consumed by the corruption, and only the war realm still stands. There are several billion humans left alive, most of them are mundane people, some are awakened warriors. Among those warriors, Neffys and I are two of the strongest, but our strength is woefully not enough to deal with what is coming. So, that is the reason why we came to the tomb of Ariel. To have a chance of becoming stronger. Sunny paused for a second. But the great river is not how we expected to find it. Neffys finally spoke then, her voice reserved. You did not seem surprised to see us, Ananke. How did you know to come and welcome us? Did Dusk send you a message in a dream? In the nightmare, Ananke had received a dream message. That was how she had been able to meet Sunny and Neffys in her catch. They assumed that it was Dusk of Fallen Grace, the last Sibyl of the river. People, who had sent the message, but actually, they did not know for sure. It could have been Torment, instead. It could have even been the Mad Prince himself. Torment and the Mad Prince did not exist anymore, so. Ananke glanced at them in surprise. Dusk of Fallen Grace? No. She had been long dead by the time Weave was destroyed. Dusk was the last Sibyl to succumb to the defilement, so her grand burial was meant to signify the end of the river people. But instead, it paved the way for a new beginning. She glanced around the lounge cabin, as if taking in the sight. The cabin was spacious and cozy, set and decorated in a way that only spaces where somebody lived could be. It was clear that Ananke had made the mysterious ship into her home, having spent numerous years living aboard it. She smiled. No, it was that scoundrel, King Kronos, who promised me that you would come one day. If I only endured long enough. Ananke glanced into the distance, her smile turning wistful. Kronos was the one who built this ship, as well, the Time Slayer. She remained silent for a few moments, then sighed. The Sibyls guided and protected the river people, you see. So when the last of them fell, the river people lost their way. They could have remained lost, or forged a new path. Kronos was a young man when Dusk of Fallen Grace perished, and because of that, he could see more than those who were older and wiser than him. His mind was sharp and flexible, and his aspect granted him powers over the essence of the great river, over time. So, he envisioned a path to salvation. Sunny blinked a few times. Kronos. The brat from Fallen Grace, Kronos. Was she tall capping about the youth who used to follow Sunny around, endlessly asking silly questions and acting comically stunned every time he heard an answer? Ananke nodded. Yes, that brat eventually became King Kronos, the first supreme born of the river people, arguably, though, he never stopped being a brat. So the description fits. She chuckled. Before that, however, he built this ship, a ship capable of sailing the great river, free of the tyranny of time. The ship that allowed the river people to travel the currents as if they were outsiders. She shook her head with a smile. Kronos assembled a motley crew of powerful champions from the last human settlements on the great river. Some of them were from Fallen Grace and other cities built by the Sibyls, some were descendants of the outsiders the Serpent King had brought into the tomb of Ariel, some were even from the last remaining tribes of the river nomads. Ananke's wistful smile widened a little. El sailed on the Timeslayer as well, for a time, even if I was not a member of its crew. It was just that Kronos needed a shaper, and so, he came to weave in search of me. She fell silent, and her smile slowly disappeared, replaced by a dark expression. But all the while, the defilement was spreading like a plague, encroaching upon the great river from the distant reaches of the ancient past, from Verge. The first seeker was becoming stronger, and the defiled were growing more numerous. The river nomads were soon to be eradicated. The human cities were going to fall, as well. Even Weave was slowly collapsing under the onslaught of the harrowing horrors of the far future, of your time, possibly. Ananke sighed and glanced away. Eventually, Kronos of Fallen Grace attained supremacy and became King Kronos. The humans of the Tomb of Ariel rallied under the banners of two supremes, then, him and the Serpent King. However, even if the two of them were allies, they did not see eye to eye on all matters. The Serpent King wanted to destroy the first Seeker, while Kronos thought that if the first Seeker could be destroyed, the Sibyls would have destroyed it a long time ago. Sunny raised an eyebrow. What was his plan, then? Ananke chuckled. Kronos. Why, he wanted to outlast it. She remained silent for a moment, then said in a distant tone. The greatest obstacle Darren and Kronos faced was that the river people could not be assembled into an army. Their cities were too far apart by then, after all, and it would have taken innumerable generations to bring them together. The number of outsiders had dwindled, as well, and even the great power of the transcendent wanderers from the Twilight Sea was not enough to help Darren besiege Verge. And even if the Time Slayer was there to sail the great river, it could only carry so many warriors on its deck. Nephis frowned. So what did Kronos do? Ananke glanced at them and smiled faintly. She remained silent for a bit, and then said in a neutral tone. What else? He broke the great river. 2934 Fortress of Time. Sunny and Nephis forgot about the food, the wine, and the tea. The eerie stillness, the silence, the dead emptiness of it all, was the doing of a human. Of a supreme born from the river people. How? It was only recently that Nephis said that they did not understand the divine sorcery of Ariel, the demon of dread, and therefore could not know how the great river had been brought to a halt. And yet, Kronos seemed to have figured it out. Ananke chuckled. That, I cannot answer. I knew Kronos better than most, but even I did not know what was going on in his head. At times, it seemed like no one did, not even Kronos himself. His brilliant mind was full of the past, the present, and the future. Things that had already happened to the rest of us were a mystery to him, at times, and things that were yet to happen were like a distant memory. His ideas were always outrageous, and things that everyone considered impossible were often nothing but a fascinating puzzle to him. Her smile dimmed a little. It often felt like he was lost in his own mind, out there at the end. But I am getting ahead of myself. First, Kronos had a problem, and he found a way to solve it. He took his shipmates and sailed past Verge, into the estuary, and there, he did something to break the cycle of the great river. He made it stop. She looked at Sunny and Neffys with a wry expression. And just like that, the river people weren't divided anymore. We were not chained to our cities anymore, and when the Defiled attacked, we had a choice of retreating from the battle, or launching an attack of our own. There was some hesitation, of course, but eventually, we all decided to abandon the waters where we had been born. Although, we, people of Weave, had hesitated the longest. Ananke sighed. By then, I had long left the Time Slayer and returned home to take my place as the priestess. Weave was constantly under attack, and every battle we won came at a terrible price. But still, we were reluctant to abandon the city. Our elders were exiled to join the people who had driven them away. In the end, however, the war against the horrors of the future became too untenable, and we prepared to sail into the past, what used to be past, at least, before the river died. Sunny shifted slightly. Neffys and I sailed past the Guans of Weave on our way here. We saw the signs of the battle, what destroyed it, in the end. Ananke looked into the distance, a somber expression appearing on her lovely face. She remained silent for a while, then took a deep breath. That, we do not know either. On the last day we spent in Weave before abandoning it forever, a swarm of the corrupted, far more terrifying than any before it, descended upon us like a curse. The battle was desperate. I led our warriors to hold the enemy back while those who could not fight fled. We were planning to sever the anchors of the houses of youth and use them as ships to sail downstream, but people needed time to reach them. Her expression turned distant as she recollected the desperate battle from the ancient past. We were successful, in the end. We stalled the enemy long enough for the houses of youth to sail. My warriors retreated, as well, or at least tried to. We were on the outskirts of the city, besieged from all sides and only a few minutes away from being eradicated, when it happened. The sky seemed to ripple, and a vast darkness escaped from the rifts torn in its azure expanse like a flood. Then, something dark and formless plummeted into the river, piercing the heart of the city, the island where the Temple of the Nightmare Spell stood. She paled a little, then shook her head with a heavy sigh. The destruction caused by the impact was so devastating that most of the city was instantly shattered and drowned. It was heartbreaking to see Weave drown right before my eyes, but, at the same time, the corrupted had already overrun it by then. So, they suffered from the calamity the most. In fact, most of them were torn apart and killed by the shockwave. That was why my remaining warriors and I managed to escape, in the end. Sunny frowned. Was it another abomination from upstream? What was its rank? What was its class? Ananke shook her head. I couldn't tell you. That thing had always existed in the tomb of Ariel, arriving once in a few generations, moving across the sky like a comet made out of pure terror, although it began to appear more often after the great river died. But no one was ever able to see what was hidden under the churning darkness that surrounded it. People called it the Dark Wanderer and believed it to be an omen of great destruction. Perhaps it was indeed a corrupted being of immense power, or perhaps it was simply a manifestation of the river dying. A symptom of the walls of the realm Ariel had created slowly coming undone. She shrugged. Perhaps it is moving across the sky above us right at this moment, only, with the suns gone, we cannot see it pass. She looked away, as if reminiscing about the past. The Dark Wanderer appeared before the final siege of Verge, as well. And that siege ended in great and irrevocable devastation, indeed. So perhaps it really was an evil omen. Ananke sighed and looked back at Sunny and Neffys. After King Kronos stopped the river, all the humans who remained alive in the tomb of Ariel eventually came to dwell in a single city, in Fallen Grace. Fallen Grace was the LA Street bastion of the river people, poised against Verge like a mortal enemy. Only, as I mentioned, its two rulers disagreed on what to do. Darren wanted to lay siege to Verge, while Kronos wanted to create an impregnable fortress that the Defiled would never be able to breach. A fortress of time, a safe haven, an ark to weather the endless storm. She let out a sigh. In the end, most of the river people chose to follow an outsider instead of their own king. They chose to follow Darren and the Paragons of the Twilight Sea into battle, and they lost. Ananke's distant expression betrayed a hint of sorrow. Kronos was right, in the end. The first Seeker could not be destroyed. Instead, everything that touched it was destroyed, was defiled. Countless people lost their lives, and countless more succumbed to the corruption. The best of us perished during the first siege of Verge. The war continued for a long while after that, of course. The Serpent King besieged the cursed city several more times, but he simply could not kill the first seeker. His glory, his cunning, his bravery. It all ended in despair. She looked down. Too many of us died, and not enough were being born. We were only ever growing weaker and fewer, while the defiled kept getting stronger and more numerous. In the span of a single generation, the river people came to the threshold of being destroyed. This was the dusk of our civilization, and finally, it all ended when the Serpent King himself was infected by a seed of corruption during his last battle with the First Seeker. Her eyes were wistful. He did not succumb to it immediately, but by then, his end was inevitable. That was when Darren and Kronos finally joined hands again. And, together, they finally achieved their goal. She exhaled slowly and then said in a mournful tone, "They destroyed the First Seeker. They erased the defilement from existence, and laid ruin to Verge." Sunny was utterly stunned for a moment. He even forgot to breathe. "What? How?" Anank smiled sadly. "We starved them." She looked at the delicious food arrayed on the table and sighed. Kronos had never been able to build his ark. But in the end, he did. He built it from the Serpent King's bones. From his soul sea, as well. Darren helped Kronos devise the sorcery and sacrificed himself to form its walls. While Kronos sacrificed his remaining time. They built a miniature realm inside the realm of Ariel, one that could exist outside time for a while, and so, we hid inside of it and waited. The river people abandoned the great river, leaving it to their enemy. To the defiled, and without humans to devour, the defiled starved. Anank chuckled. Nothing could touch the First Seeker without becoming corrupted. So what could destroy the First Seeker? She sighed. The corrupted could. Left without anything to feed upon, they eventually turned to the greatest source of sustenance left on the great river, to the vast, abominable sea of flesh that had created them. The defiled devoured the First Seeker, and in the end, they devoured each other as well. All that was left of them were bones. Anank looked at Sunny and Nephis and smiled wistfully. That was how the defilement was destroyed. 2935 outside time. The First Seeker was dead, devoured by the same abominations it had created. The abominations were dead, too. Darren of the Twilight Sea was gone. So was Kronos, the king of the river people. Even the great river was dead, its dwindling waters standing still. Silence and desolation ruled the tomb of Ariel now, suffused with darkness. The time SLAers sailed across the empty dark void of the tomb of Ariel, drawing closer and closer to the estuary. In fact, Sunny judged that they should have already reached it, but there was nothing but silent darkness around them. No water, no mist, no treacherous currents. He had been wondering how to find the heart of the estuary without the guiding light, but it seemed like that would not pose a problem. Anank was at the helm of the ancient ship, its sails full of wind. Unlike the chain breaker, the time SLAUer did not possess an inherent ability to fly. There was no sacred tree growing around its main mast, and no runic array to keep it in the vast expanse of the skies. Instead, it was able to fly because Anank was channeling a verse that allowed it to. She had already been an experienced shaper when they met in the nightmare, and her skill as a sorceress seemed to have greatly developed since then. She could wield her will now, too, so, it was not that surprising to see her masterfully keep the ancient ship afloat in the air. It was still an amazing sight, though. We should reach the Ark soon. Sunny looked at her and finally asked the question that had been on his mind from the moment they met. How many people are left in that time fortress? Anank remained silent for a moment, looking into the distance with a hint of melancholy in her beautiful eyes. Eventually, she said simply, "None." She studied the bronze navigation tools arrayed in front of her on the deck of the Time Slayer and sighed. The Ark outlasted Verge, but in the end, it collapsed as well. Time doesn't spare anyone. After all, everything falls to its tyranny. Even the gods could not escape their fate, so how could something created by mortals exist forever? Anank shook her head. It felt like only a few years had passed, to us, but thousands of years must have flown past the Ark before its sorcery finally ran out. When we emerged, the great river was entirely different. The tomb of Ariel had become alien to us, and we needed to explore it like pioneers. Her expression dimmed. Of course, what we discovered was that it was not a place suited for human life anymore. It couldn't sustain us. We were going to starve, just like the defiled had starved, And worse than that, we weren't the only ones who still dwelled in the tomb of Ariel. Ananke grimaced. Everything has consequences, you see. Kronos broke the great river to save the river people, but in doing so, he set in motion the events that would destroy the Ark one day, and doom the people he wanted to protect. She glanced at the vast emptiness that surrounded them. This used to be the estuary, a place where the past flowed into the future. A timeless place. So, that was where Kronos and Darren built the Ark. They used the nature of the estuary to strengthen the sorcery that kept it hidden outside time, and tethered it to the waters of the estuary. It was a brilliant design, truly. But, her expression turned wistful, but the river was dead. Its waters were growing shallow. The distance between the future and the past was diminishing, and soon enough, the river began to dry up. It began from the estuary, and once the estuary dwindled, the Ark became unmoored. The sorcery that sustained it was left without a source, and we were left without a safe harbor. Ananke glanced at Sunny and Neffys. There were a lot of things we had to discover. The fate of the first seeker and Verge, the shallow areas of the river, the desolation that left us without a source of sustenance, but most important of all, we discovered that the defiled used to play an important role, as well. She shook her head. They held back the horrors that dwelled at the dawn of time, in the furthest reaches of the great river. With the first seeker gone, nothing deterred them from swimming upstream anymore. The length of the river greatly diminished, and the distance between what used to be the past and what used to be the future was not as vast as it had been before. So, the horrors of the distant future traveled downstream, as well. Her smile turned a little dark. Even though the defilement was gone, the river teemed with harrowing abominations. There was no shelter for us anywhere, and nothing for us to sustain ourselves with, not the entire population of the Ark, at least. Every day, we fought desperately for survival, and every day, salvation seemed more distant than before. We faced extinction, we were going to die, just like the rest of this dead world. Neffys spoke in a quiet tone. But, obviously, you did not die, Ananke. Ananke chuckled. Yes, that is true. And for a very simple reason, at that. She looked into the distance and sighed. It was because of Kronos, of what he told me before we parted for the last time. He said that if I endure long enough, if I stay alive long enough, then one day, the children of Weaver will come, and bring salvation with them. And so, I endeavored to stay alive. I waited. Sunny and Neffys both remained silent, not knowing what to say. Ananke, meanwhile, glanced ahead and smiled. Ah, here it is, the Ark. They glanced forward, as well. There, the bones of a colossal serpent floated in the emptiness. From afar, the great skeleton seemed like a flawlessly white ring that was contoured sharply against the boundless darkness. Devouring its own tail. 2936 Serpent's Ark. It was only when the Time Slayer drew closer to the remains of the Serpent King that they were able to appreciate the enormous size of the ancient skeleton. Each vertebra was large enough to dwarf the ancient ship, and its skull was like a cavernous harbor. Darren of the Nightmare had been enormous in his bestial form, but he had not been nearly as colossal as the real Serpent King seemed to have been just before his death. Sunny stared at the ancient bones, feeling a powerful mixture of reverence and wistfulness. He had found many traces of Darren over the years, both in the dream realm and in the nightmare. And perhaps because Sunny had met and spoken with his daughter, Windflower, it almost felt like he and the Serpent King knew each other. There had been their battle, as well. So, seeing the final resting place of the ancient Supreme, the only Supreme of the Twilight Sea, he could not help but feel a pang of sorrow. So this was where your nightmare ended. Sunny sighed heavily. Darren had been so powerful, so cunning, so determined. He had strived to resist the nightmare and save his people so earnestly. But his journey had ended here, in the darkness, in bitter defeat. Even if his death paved the way for those who would come after him, Sunny could not help but feel that such an end was unjust. Darren deserved better, but then again, they all did. Ananke guided the Time Slayer to the skull of the great serpent and moored it to a dock built upon it. Soon enough, they were inside. Sunny did not know what he had expected to see, but there were actually several buildings built inside the skull of the Serpent King, as well as 2 crossing streets and a square. It was as if he was looking at a small port. There was not a soul around. Looking around, Sunny judged that people had lived here once, but for the longest time, Ananke remained here alone. She led them to one of the homes and made a fire in the hearth, then sat in front of it to warm her hands. Sunny looked around, noticing the signs of someone having lived in this little home for a long time, and asked, "So, this is the Ark?" Ananke shook her head. "Goodness, no. The Ark was hidden inside a pocket dimension, and that dimension was contained within the inner space of this bone ring. We actually had soil, wind, grass, and a semblance of a sun there. This, meanwhile, was merely a forward base, of sorts. A place for those who guarded and maintained the Ark to stay while performing their duties. She sighed. And when the Ark began collapsing, this became the shelter for those who ventured outside the estuary to explore the great river. And in the end, it was the final shelter of the river people, as well. Ananke remained silent for a short while, then said in a somber tone. When we understood that the situation was untenable, we attempted to come up with a way to save at least some of our people. But all we could think of, in the end, was to create lesser versions of the Ark and try to postpone our extinction for as long as we could. She shook her head. The great river could not sustain the remains of the river people anymore, so we chose the 7 strongest transcendent champions among us. Each of the champions was entrusted with an Ark amulet, an enchanted locket. That contained a small pocket dimension of its own, its inhabitants frozen in time. The remaining river people surrendered themselves to the Ark amulets, and then, we scattered. Ananke smiled bitterly. It would have been better to stay together and lean on each other, perhaps, but we figured that if each of us went their own way, then even if most of us perished, at least one would survive in the end. So, each of the 7 Ark Guardians left for a remote corner of the great river, determined to find a way to survive. Sunny held his breath for a moment. And did they survive? Ananke remained silent for a long while, then slowly shook her head. No. One after the other, they all died. A sad smile illuminated her lovely face. Only I remained. Sunny felt sad for her, as well. But after a moment of compassion, he finally realized the meaning of her words. Wait, if you were one of the Ark Guardians, then does that mean that you had been entrusted with one of these Ark amulets, too? Ananke studied him for a few moments, then smiled and pulled a cord that was tied around her neck. A moment later, Sunny saw it. 7 flawlessly white lockets, seemingly carved from the same bone that surrounded them, were hanging on the cord like a heavy necklace. There was a beast that resembled a dog carved on one of them, a fish on another, a beetle on the third. Ananke let go of the cord, hiding the lockets under her mantle once more. The other 6 perished, but I did manage to recover their amulets. So, they are all with me, now, the people whom Darren and CRO knows had saved. As Sunny and Neffys looked at her in shock, Ananke said with a smile. People from the Fallen Grace, from Weave, from the river nomad tribes. The descendants of the outsiders from the Twilight Sea, as well, even their royal princess, the granddaughter of the Serpent King. All that remains of the river people is here, with me, under my protection and care. Dozens of thousands of people, all in all. She patted her chest, where the 7 lockets hang, hidden by the black fabric of her mantle. So even if I waited for a long time, alone, it never felt like it. And now, my long wait is over, because of you, my lord and lady. Salvation Kronos had promised me, it has finally arrived.